Broadcast.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'm clicking on that. That'll start you going.
This one?
There you go.
Welcome to the third Earn Maryland webinar, Mobilizing Your Partnership, Preparing for the Launch. Thank you for joining us. I am Elizabeth Sachs, a Senior Advisor at the Maryland Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation and responsible for implementation of the Earn Maryland Grant Program. This is the third and final in our series of 3 webinars this summer. As most of you know, this 3-part webinar series has been the first phase of the rollout of Earn Maryland. This new law and the $4.5 million behind it is designed to support a new industry-led workforce and economic development strategy through the creation and expansion of strategic industry partnerships across the state. Participation in all 3 of these webinars, and that certainly includes your going back and viewing any ones that you missed, which will be archived on our website, will position you well to apply for the forthcoming Earn Maryland Strategic Industry Partnership Planning Grant. The solicitation will be released early this fall. All 3 of our webinars have been presented and will be today by Lindsay Woolsey of the Woolsey Group. For nearly a decade, Lindsay has studied the policy and program elements of successful industry sector strategies, including engaging industry, coordination of programs to support employers and workers, rural economies, career pathways, and evaluation and benchmarking models. Lindsay has worked in more than a dozen states, and most recently in Colorado, California, and Arizona, working with a variety of industry sectors, including healthcare, manufacturing, energy, technology, agriculture, tourism, and bioscience. Before we begin, I want to go over a few ground rules for the webinar. All participants are in listen-in mode. To ask a question, please type it into the question box to the right of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can throughout the presentation and at the very end, and we'll also send out a follow-up Q&A should there be any questions we're unable to answer during the presentation. Feel free to test the question function now by introducing yourself in the question box. As you know, this is a 1-hour webinar. We expect the presentation to last about 40 minutes and again, hope to have time for questions. I also would like to go over a few listening tips. If you cannot hear us and you've logged in via telephone, please click on the telephone icon. If you logged in via audio, you can click on the MIC icon and also make sure you turn up the volume on your end of the line. And in general, please limit background noise. It will help you be able to hear the presentation. Now I'd like to turn things over to our presenter, Lindsay Woolsey.
Great. Thanks very much, Elizabeth. And hi, everybody. It's great to be back for the third and last webinar in this series. As Elizabeth said, this is a series that is intended to really build foundational knowledge for setting up strong strategic industry partnerships. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to do a very quick recap on Industry Partnerships 101, as well as how you turn industry data into usable information. And then we're going to jump into today's topic, which is launching a strategic industry partnership. The when, the who, the how, and to what end. So we're going to jump to our first slide here, which many of you have already seen. This is the graphic that really shows what a sector partnership or industry partnership is. You should know, by the way, that these things go by many names all over the country. Everything from skill panels in Washington State, clusters of opportunity in California, sector partnerships in Colorado, industry partnerships in Pennsylvania. They go by different names, but they all follow a similar model. They are a partnership of employers from one single industry with stakeholders and public programs that need to come together to really help meet the needs of that industry's growth in a region. The outcomes for workers are very, very good. The outcomes for employers are very, very good. Sector partnerships have been around long enough now that we actually have evidence that show workers advance out of poverty when they are going through training programs affiliated with sector partnerships. We see things like increased productivity as a result for employers, their workers that go through training affiliated with sector partnerships. So there's a lot that is already going into our basic level of evidence across the country that supports the model of industry partnerships. So we'll move on, and again, you've seen this before as well, but you should know that today's industry partnerships have a few key factors that are critical. They are employer-driven, regional. They are convened by a credible third party. That could be you. They act as a coordinating body across multiple education, workforce development, economic development, and other programs. They work because they create highly customized responses to a target industry's needs. But today's industry partnerships, what makes them different from years past is that they are more about than just workforce training. They focus on competitiveness issues broadly for an industry in a region. They also treat employers as partners, not just customers. And that's a shift from what we have traditionally done in the past. They are not a grant program. They are not a short-term training project or a passing fad. Good industry partnerships last for a long time. They are a long-term strategic partnership. So the next slide, this is getting to our most recent webinar all about data. Every good industry partnership starts with data, but you've got to know what it's going to give you and what it's not going to give you. What it gives you is a baseline of information. What it gives you is a way to prioritize which industries are really driving growth and jobs in our community. And we got to know that because what we want to do is make sure that people in our community are getting those jobs. It's a starting place for a conversation. But as you well know, no data is perfect. There's always a lag. There's always missing data. Sometimes there's too much data, and you get paralyzed in that data. And what you should also know is that there is no substitute for actual conversations with employers, and that's why industry partnerships come into play. They are a conversation that is an ongoing dialogue with employers in your target industry. Next slide, which data points matter most? I won't go into the details of this, but I encourage you, if you missed the last webinar, to please view it. These are some data points that I have seen across the country be used to really inform how you select a target industry or how you confirm that we are actually focusing on the right target industry for our regional economy, for our employers, and for our workers. If you don't have all these data points, you work with what you have. Next slide. Data is flat until you do something with it. So your job is to get those data points to interact. And I highly recommend that you don't do this alone at your desk in your office. I recommend you do this with your partners across program and often siloed program lines. So you want workforce development and economic development and education and other stakeholders in the same room looking at the same data. The opportunity to discuss that data, to add information that is anecdotal, that is on-the-ground knowledge that the data points may not reflect, that's the power of a data discussion. And you can really come to some agreement and even start to build buy-in across program lines about which industries drive our regional economy and therefore warrant collective effort to grow and collective effort to find the jobs that our community members can get. Next slide, there is an exception. Up till now, I have really talked about program partners getting together to look at data. Workforce and economic development and community colleges and community-based organizations. But you might be an employer, and I suspect even that there are some employers on the phone right now. So what if you as a firm or a company want to launch an industry partnership within your industry and within the region where you reside? Do you need this data to make that decision? Of course not. You already know. I work in this industry. I'm a firm in this industry. I want something to happen. But this data can be really useful still for a couple reasons. One, to have a conversation with your peers. Two, to uncover information about your industry that you may not know or that you need confirmed. It's a powerful way, too, then to go to your program partners, including workforce developers, community college folks, economic development leaders, and talk to them about what can we do to better support my industry in this region. We're going to come back to this. And what I'm going to call this, just as a placeholder, is what if you as an employer want to actually be the convener of an industry partnership, because that happens. Next slide. You've seen this before, but this really gets us into the subject of today, and I'm just going to do a check. Elizabeth, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to move on. My screen is showing that I was disconnected from the webinar, but as long as everybody can hear me, I'm in good shape. So what's the life cycle of an industry partnership? You can see there are a number of steps, and we've already talked about the dive into the data. We've talked about how the data dive can actually help build buy-in across multiple public systems. That's a big next step. You also want to identify and agree on a partnership convener and start finding the natural leaders in industry. This is all going to lead up to what I call the big launch. After the launch, you want to bring others along, follow through, you want to get some early wins, you want to track progress, and you want to keep it going. We're going to get into this. Every industry partnership that I have seen across the country looks very different. They last for a different number of years. They focus on a different set of issues. They change constantly. That's a good thing. The beauty of industry partnerships is that they are, again, customized to the needs of an industry in one region. So they should look different. If we move on to the next slide, there are some core elements and factors that we have learned over the years about what works well and not so well when you're setting up an industry partnership. You could consider this your do's and your don'ts list. We're going to start with the very first one, and I'm going to zip through these pretty quickly. Clusters of companies work well. For an industry partnership, individual firms, not so much. Here's why. There is always going to be a place, and there's always going to be an importance for you as individual programs to work with individual firms. A business comes into your one-stop and needs certain business services. They have a certain vacancy they need filled. This will always be part of your service repertoire. But an industry partnership is different in that you are truly working with the industry as a whole, not an individual company. And the beauty of that is that you start recognizing what are the common needs and the highest priority needs of our industry, not just an individual company. It's very powerful because, again, as we talked about during the last webinar, you get a lot more bang for your public dollar buck, which we need to pay attention to if you are working with a cluster of companies versus individual firms. Next slide. We've talked about this too, employers as partners versus employers as customers. Once again, you will always be serving employers in a customer fashion. Whether you're a college, whether you are an economic development entity, whether you are a workforce board or a community-based organization, you're always going to have that in your portfolio. But the difference with an industry partnership is that employers act as partners. In fact, they even put skin in the game sometimes. They will support via in-kind, via their time, and via financial contributions, specific solutions that the partnership is coming up with, because they get that this is going to help their individual company grow and their cluster grow overall. Next slide. Industry-driven versus system or institution-driven. We talk about industry-driven a lot, right? In fact, we talk about demand-driven a lot because that's what the Workforce Investment Act was designed to do, to be. It's still really hard to figure out what that means. In an industry partnership, what that means is that employers are calling the shots in some ways. They are mostly charting the course for where the partnership is going versus a program or a system or an institution that may say something like, you've got a need, hey, we've got a program for that. Let me just take it off the shelf and give it to you, and we'll be done. We'll be ready to go. Now, that's putting it very bluntly. It never happens exactly like that, right? But in many cases, employers start to push away from the table. They don't attend that second meeting or that third meeting because what they start seeing is solutions being developed too quickly that don't feel like solutions that they are coming up with. And that is a challenge that we deal with on a constant basis. We collectively, meaning I see this across the country. With the best intentions, programs sometimes jump too quickly and the industry voice is lost. So the next slide. Regionally based versus statewide, top-down, or too local. We've talked about this too. It is possible to go too big and it is possible to go too small. You have to be flexible to figure out what is the right scope of geographic region for my strategic industry partnership. And this is going to look different for every industry that you target. If you go statewide, it's very difficult to get to the level of depth and detail that you may need to get to understand what an industry need is. If you go to local, a neighborhood industry-focused initiative, for example, it's very difficult to get the breadth that you need to really have a strategic industry partnership that is focused on multiple priorities. So you want to be careful. You want to find a middle ground. Next, existing industry strength or emerging specialty versus wishful thinking. My favorite example of this is about 10 years ago when everybody in the country suddenly wanted to be the next nanotechnology hub of the world. And to be honest with you, many of them did not have the right to become the next nanotechnology center of the world. Why? Because they didn't have an existing strength already that would really position them well to become that. Strategic industry partnerships build on existing industry strengths or emerging specialties. You got to have something to start with. That's why you pay such close attention to what the data is telling you. How many jobs are already here? Is the sector growing? Has it grown in the past 2 years? What's the projections? What types of jobs are these? Are they good jobs that will provide family-sustaining wages for our community members? What do we know about this? What's emerging about this sector that we didn't necessarily know before we looked at the data or before we talked to employers? You want to really find those strengths, and that's what you want to build on. Next slide. We've talked about this too. Strategic industry partnerships today are more than just workforce focused. They are about industry competitiveness and growth overall. And you get a lot further when you ask the question of employers in your target industry, what are your big growth opportunities now and on the horizon for our region? I guarantee you that workforce development is going to be one of those opportunities. And you're going to get to some pretty specific training needs in that conversation. But I also guarantee there's going to be some priorities and opportunities that you never guessed would come out of that conversation. The reason you want that is because if you have a good set of 2 or 3 high priorities that employers within your target industry share, you're going to have a higher possibility of keeping those employers engaged at the table. Because they don't just want to talk about workforce issues. They got other things on their mind. And when you have the right set of partners around the table, such as economic development and other organizations to help meet those other needs, you've really got a strong partnership. Next slide. As I just said, the best industry partnerships I see across the country shift the conversation from being problem-driven to being opportunity-focused. If you walk into a room of employers and ask them what all their issues are and what all their problems are, you will walk out with a laundry list of to-dos. You'll walk out with a to-do list that you may not be able to fulfill or act on. But if you switch the conversation to, what are your growth opportunities and the highest priorities for action based on those growth opportunities, it's a very different conversation. And it starts to build buy-in from employers as partners, not customers. It's a big difference. Next slide. This is a biggie. Employer priorities first versus target populations first. And I want to pause here just for a minute to be very, very clear that industry partnerships are very effective vehicles for advancing low-income and low-skilled populations. The reason they are effective vehicles is because in the best cases, they coordinate well across the multitude of programs that are needed to support a low-income or low-skilled, often working adult to get through a program, to get a job, and to stay in that job and advance further. That's why they're effective vehicles. But when you are talking to employers, you want to focus on what their priorities are. And you want to focus on what skill levels and occupations are your biggest pain points. You want their priorities to pull your target populations into the right niches and the right fit and the right pathways versus being a program that is trying to push a target population onto employers as a priority. Again, it's a difference in how you approach the conversation. In the end, we do a much bigger service to target populations by allowing employers to really drive those priorities and finding ways then to build the appropriate pathways and supports for target populations to get good jobs. So that's an important piece that we can probably come back to at another time as well. Next slide. These are champion-driven, not representation-oriented. This is a big one, too. You need champions from your public programs and from your employers. Instead of making the list of all the programs that need to be involved in a strong industry partnership, you want to make the list of the people, the movers and shakers, the doers. You know who they are. And if you don't, somebody does. So instead of just checking boxes off and making sure we've got all the right programs in the room, you want to find the champions within those programs and jurisdictions. That might seem obvious, but too often I see the box-checking approach. Next slide. This is about coalitions of the willing, not the futile search for consensus. There will always be employers and companies, as well as programs and public partners that just aren't at the table or don't necessarily agree or are on board fully. That's okay. You cannot spend all of your time searching for complete consensus. You have to move on with the coalition of the willing based on, again, the priorities that employers have identified. Next slide. Once again, this is repetitive, but this is important. It's about people and relationships, not about checking boxes off a list of organizations and jurisdictions. Next slide. This is a disciplined, replicable process, not a mysterious, unique occurrence. What do I mean by that? I mean that this can actually happen anywhere and everywhere. It can happen in cities. It can happen in extreme rural areas. It can happen in any place in between. So often what I hear is, we can't do that here because of X, Y, and Z. And the important message here is that the recipe is almost more important than the ingredients. In other words, industry partnerships work all over the country in both rural and urban and everything in between areas, and in almost every industry that I have worked in, because there is a process of building the partnership. There is a process of targeting employers and getting the right priorities and conversations together. This doesn't just happen because of some magic. And so that's really important to remember, that this can happen anywhere. Next slide. I want to pause just for a moment to check with Elizabeth. Are there any questions at this point?
Nope. So far, we're good to go. Proceed.
Okay, great. We will have time for more questions, so if you have them, please put them in the question box. So getting to step-by-step launching a strategic industry partnership. What I'm going to go through in the next 15 minutes really should be considered just some ground rules, and you should use these as a rough guide. In other words, find your own fit. Make these steps fit into your stage of development. But remember your end goal. You want to build strategic industry partnerships in your region's most critical industries for two reasons. You're going to need, you want to have an ongoing vehicle to keep tabs on and understand the training needs of your target industry. You don't want this just to be a one-time input session from industry on their training needs. You also, as regional partners, have the opportunity to really grow your region's critical industry sectors by tackling more than workforce training issues. So the opportunity to think about long-term launches of a strategic industry partnership in your region is that opportunity to really think about more than just workforce. What are the other priorities that we could collectively be tackling? Because in the end, that's about jobs. And in the end, that's going to help your community members. Next slide. The very first step, making the case for a new approach, because strategic industry partnerships are a new approach. They're a new approach to how education, workforce development, and economic development act and interact. It's a new approach because, again, this is not a one-time thing. It's a new way of operating. And who are you making this case to? First of all, yourself. Second of all, your program and system partners and industry employers. So next slide. What we just went through is a pretty big step in the direction of making the case for a new approach. On the what works well side is the new approach of industry partnerships. On the not so well side, oftentimes this is how traditionally across the country workforce, education, and economic development have acted. Next slide. Finally, if you haven't used these yet, you should. And go ahead and click again, Elizabeth, and we'll get all of these up. These are the outcomes of strong industry partnerships. This really makes the case. It should make the case to you, to your partners, and even to employers that this is an effective model for education, workforce, and economic development. I'm not going to go through all of these because we've gone through them a few times. But if you want, come back to these and really study some of these outcomes. Step 2 after making the case for this new approach is what we covered earlier in the week, diving into your data. And again, if you missed webinar number 2, watch the recording. You want to know which sectors in my region employ the most people. Are they good jobs? Is the sector growing? What's special about our region for this industry, if anything? And then you want to make choices about how you use your collective time and resources. And that means having conversations with others beyond your program and jurisdiction. And data is a fantastic way to have that conversation. This moves us to step 3, building buy-in across program partners. I'll say it again, I've said it before, data is a great way to begin the buy-in process. You want to follow that up with a conversation that's what's everyone up to right now related to our region's most critical industries. If you started looking at the healthcare industry when you were diving into your data, you want to know, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? Having multiple programs from education and workforce and economic development in the room to really have that conversation is critically important. You can have these conversations collectively in a room. You can also have them one-on-one. But here's a good question. Who's responsible for convening these conversations? So that moves us to step number 4, identifying and agreeing on a strategic industry partnership convener. And I want to be clear here. The initial convener of the conversations may not ultimately be the long-term convener of the strategic industry partnership. That's okay. You, the collective you, meaning your multiple program partners, still need someone to start and organize the dialogue, to assemble the shared set of facts and start coordinating across partners. This person, this organization can be anyone. Workforce development, a college, an economic development entity, a community-based organization, even an employer. You need someone to start organizing outreach to employers as well. Once you have collectively decided these are our 1, 2, or 3 most critical industries driving our regional economy that we should all be focusing on. Consider, especially for the fall, for the planning grant purposes of EARN, that the initial convener may be the planning grant applicant. So let's talk more about the convener. The next slide, attributes of a good convener. The initial convener must be willing to put in some upfront time. You got to have some credibility with diverse program partners. You have to set aside turf and facilitate others to do the same. And you got to keep reminding everyone of the end goals. The end goal is a strong industry partnership. The end goal is working better together in non-duplicative ways to support your target industry. The long-term convener of a strategic industry partnership has some very similar attributes. That individual or organization has to create the time needed to administer an industry partnership. And here's where you may start to explore how to co-convene a strategic industry partnership. Is it an economic development entity partnering with a workforce board? Is it a community-based organization partnering with a community college? Now, remember that whoever convenes these partnerships, and it can be just about anybody, everybody else still sits around the table as a core key partner. You've got to be able to facilitate the strategic industry partnership without charting its course. Because remember, that's the job of industry. You've got to be able to assess short-term wins and long-term strategies, and you've got to coordinate across public programs and partners and community partners to get to implementation. Once again, you want to keep the end goal in mind. Before we move on, I'm going to give you one example. This example comes from all the way across the country in Spokane, Washington. And this is an example that demonstrates, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about the role of a convener and the role of multiple public partners and employers at the table. In Spokane, the Workforce Development Council convenes 2 industry partnerships, a construction industry partnership and a healthcare industry partnership. Around the table, the Regional Chamber of Commerce and City Chamber of Commerce are key partners. 2 of their community colleges are key partners, community-based organizations, and of course the employers. Meanwhile, the Chamber of Commerce for the City of Spokane convenes their manufacturing industry partnership. Who sits at the table as a core partner? Of course, the Workforce Development Council, the community colleges, and other community programs. In the meantime, the community colleges convene 2 additional industry partnerships, one for professional services and one focused on energy. Who sits around those tables? Once again, the Workforce Development Council, the Chamber, community-based organizations. So you can begin to see how the co-convening can work, how the lead convener responsibilities can be spread across multiple organizations, but how everybody is involved in these industry partnerships. Why do they have 5 industry partnerships? Because those were the 5 industries that they discovered really drive their regional economy. So we'll move on. Any questions at this point?
So, Lizzie, we do have one question. I'm hoping you can answer it in terms of, again, the helpful examples from other states. And the question really is, this is a lot of work, data analysis, convening, organizing. How do you get it done on top of your regular workload? And who in this, does someone in this strategic industry partnership have to hire additional staff to make this work? And again, are there examples from other states that you can give us?
That's a great question because, yes, this does take work. Industry partnerships, I always say, are not rocket science. They're pretty commonsensical, but they do take work because they take coordination. And so up front, it does require a somebody, and again, this is the initial convener, to put some of that work in. To say, hey, we've got some data. We're all going to look at it. I want to convene a conversation. Let's at least start there. And then to do the follow-through. Hey, guys, we all decided that we want to focus collectively on these two industries. Let's now talk about what that's going to look like. It does take work. There's no doubt about it. Here's the thing. In some situations, foundations, employers are already at the ready to help fund a staff person, where states are able to subsidize a staff person, at least for that initial convening stage. That's fantastic. In most cases, that doesn't actually exist. And so what happens is an individual organization and a person decide that a portion of their staff time should be repurposed for the initial convening. At some point down the line, hopefully soon, within a few months, the collective partners can make decisions about how can we share the workload and repurpose staff time. Now, the beauty of this is that once industry partnerships are set up, they attract money. And that's the truth. They leverage incredible amounts of money in some cases. But you've got to have something set up first. But in some cases, you find that employers will fund a full-time staff person to run or coordinate an industry partnership. You'll find that foundations, you'll find that grants, both federal and state, can fund a staff person. In other cases, you'll find that business service unit staff or job developers or economic development staff actually realize this is how we should be doing business anyway. And so we're going to repurpose our staffing to support industry partnerships. So Seattle-King County is a terrific example. They're not the only one. There are others around the country of WIBs, Workforce Investment Boards, that have completely repurposed their staffing to support their industry partnerships. So for example, their business service unit staff now act as industry partnership coordinators. And in Seattle-King County, at any given time, they have 5 different active industry partnerships, and a business service unit staff person is responsible for the coordination of one of them. This can be seen in Pennsylvania. It can be seen in Colorado, Arizona. It can be seen in Massachusetts. So that's another way to approach this. But there's no doubt that this does take time.
Lindy, I'm just going to interject with a question that I'll answer quickly. It gets asked every time. Can an industry partnership cross state lines? In Western Maryland, we work very closely with employers in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The solicitation will address this more specifically, but as I've definitely said on a previous webinar and other settings, if you can show that Maryland workers will benefit from the training and the subsequent jobs, you definitely should consider an industry partnership that crosses state lines an option. A closer question is, what if it's a Maryland-based employer, but more of the workforce would be from other states? That's another angle on this, and we'll have to address that more carefully with the solicitation. But certainly if a majority of the workforce lives in Maryland, you should consider it a possible partnership opportunity. So we'll move on to the next slide.
So we're now at step 5, and this is engaging industry. And I say the natural leaders of industry specifically. And that's because, once again, you don't want to just be checking boxes off from a listing of companies in your target industry in your region. You want to start really identifying who are the champions, who are the people and the relationships, who are the doers, the movers and shakers. Because remember, you're building partnerships with employers, not just serving them as customers. Here's where you really want to start discussing across multiple program partners and stakeholders, who do you know? What relationships with employers on the ground do you already have that I may not have? Start parsing that out. Start making the map. You want to build the list of real leaders in your target industry because they're going to be the leaders in your industry partnership. Only then can you build the broader invite list of employers that should also be involved. So moving on, I want to define launch before we get to that specific step. You've launched when you've had a collective conversation with a good number of employers about their growth opportunities, including their workforce needs. I always recommend that you do this collectively, not one-on-one, because the benefits of employers hearing what other employers have to say in the same room is huge. The networking power that will begin that day is huge. What's a good number? As in, how many employers are we supposed to bring into a launch or a collective conversation about their opportunities and workforce needs? It depends. It completely depends on your region. If you're in a really rural area, if you can pull together anywhere from 6 to 12 employers within a target industry, that's a good number. But if you're in a heavily populated area, you're probably going to have more. Here's a rule of thumb, though. If you are collectively having a conversation and facilitating a conversation of folks in a room, you want to be mindful of just how many people am I going to be able to facilitate a conversation around. You don't want 100. 100 people turns into a summit or a conference. You're having a conversation. And so I always recommend that you want to identify, again, the movers and shakers and leaders from companies in your target industry in your region. You probably want anywhere from 15 to 30. So you're going to have to play this by ear. And again, why a collective conversation? Because you can have 50 one-on-one conversations and synthesize all that and come up with some good outcomes. But you're missing out on the new ideas that are going to popcorn out of a conversation live in a room with multiple employers from the same industry in your region. There's real power in that. Consider using your planning grant time for this conversation. Start where you are, wherever you are. You may have already talked to employers in your target industry. You already have things going on. That's actually the more likely scenario for most of you. But use the planning grant time and space to take this to the next level. Expand the circle of employers. Have the collective conversation and start building your strategic industry partnership. Next slide. These are sample talking points only. You work with employers all the time. But here's some things that you may want to say if you take the route, which I recommend, of having this collective conversation, which I call a launch meeting. We're launching a manufacturing partnership in, I'll make something up, the Eastern Shore region. Your industry matters, and start using your data points. Here's what we know. Here's how many jobs your industry provides to our community members. There's a lot going on to support your industry, but it's not well coordinated. Or, this might fit you better, there's just not enough going on to support your industry in our area. And let me pause here and just say, employers generally have one of two experiences. One, everybody is knocking on their door, asking them what their needs are. They've got their workforce development person, their community colleges, their economic development, and likely others knocking on their door, asking them, what are your needs? Or they have the opposite experience. Nobody has ever knocked on my door. Nobody's ever asked me what I need or what the opportunities are for me. And so you want to kind of think about that. Other talking points. We don't have one place, one common table where companies can collectively discuss and prioritize needed supports and strategies. There's no one place, one easy access to the multiple services and resources available in our community. The X partnership will be that place. You can throw things in like, this is being modeled after similar partnerships found across the country. Go back to the making the case data points and evidence that we've shared before. That can really work. Tell them this is going to be driven by you. It will be action-oriented. This is not just another meeting for a meeting's sake. And it's going to be based on the highest priority growth opportunities for your industry in our region. This isn't a statewide thing. This is not a national thing. It's for our region. Priorities might be workforce-related, supply chain-oriented, infrastructure-focused, or something else we don't know yet, but that's why we need you to join a conversation to help us find out. Acknowledge that no one wants to go to another meeting. But we will be holding one to launch our partnership because it's important to have this conversation as a group. We hope you'll join us. Use these how you will. Adjust for you, of course. But these are some talking points I've certainly seen work both in an invitation and in one-on-one conversations with employers across the country. So we'll move on to the actual launch, the launch of your partnership. I've said it already, I'll say it again. I really see incredible results when it is a meeting of employers. I see good results when it's about growth opportunities, including workforce needs, not what are your biggest issues. It needs to be facilitated. Look across your program partners and figure out who's just a good facilitator. Who can do this? If you know you are, go for it. If you know that you are not, find somebody. I recommend not bringing somebody in from the outside and paying big bucks. I recommend finding somebody who is a naturally good facilitator within your partner group in your region. Remember, everybody should be there, public partners and employers alike. But the facilitator needs to make sure that the employer voice is front and center so that you really understand what the needs are. And going back to defining this industry-driven piece, here's what it is. It's firms and companies acting as active participants and active partners. It's ongoing input and guidance. It's driven by their needs. It is not firms and companies just acting as customers. It's not firms and companies convening meetings and paying for the coffee and the donuts, although I will say that can really help. If an employer wants to host a meeting, it's a powerful message to other employers. But that's not exactly what industry-driven means, right? It's not a one-time input session. We are too survey-reliant, oftentimes, in the world of workforce and education and training. This is about an ongoing conversation. And again, you're convening employers as a group. That makes it industry-driven. It does not make it single employer need-driven. That's the customer approach. So that's the big difference. Next slide. I want to come back to this idea of the employer convener scenario. Honestly, this sometimes can be the best case scenario. Employers, yes, even competitors self-convene to tackle common challenges and leverage common growth opportunities. In the very first webinar, I gave an example from Arizona of a utilities partnership where the convener is an employer. It was the employer who called up his competitors in the utilities industry and said, here's something I'm seeing. Are you seeing it too? Here's an opportunity that I think we have collectively as an industry. Are you game? And here's some very specific workforce issues that we can't solve alone. Are you finding that you have that issue too? The response from those other employers was, wow, I have never had a competitor call me to ask these questions. You bet I'm in. You bet I'll join your partnership. And they have had some incredible results as a result. You do the same stuff as an employer convener. You discuss, you prioritize, you agree on early collective action. You also want to identify the trusted public program partners that can help. And you want to make the direct request that they coordinate with each other to make needed solutions a reality. Important that we talk about this because, again, many of you on this webinar might be employers yourselves, and you may be considering acting as the convener of a strong industry partnership. I encourage it. Like any good effort, you got to do the follow-through. The minutes, the agreements, the next steps. You want to revisit the question as a group. Do we have the right convener over the long term? You want to immediately expand the circle of employers because this is how you're going to really keep the employer voice front and center. But you got to bring all of your program and stakeholder partners along. Keep them informed, bring them in for needed solutions. This really takes a village, and that's the point of a strategic industry partnership. Again, like any good effort, you want some early wins. You also want to pay attention to the long-term strategies. That means staying agile and opportunistic along the way. Strategic industry partnerships change. That's a good thing. They change over time. Finally, you want to create just enough organization. All too often, I see the first meeting, conversations coming out of that first meeting about, well, what is our organizational structure? Should we set up a separate 501c3 to manage our strategic industry partnership? I don't recommend jumping to that conclusion. Often, employers get really nervous about this because what you invited them to was a launch meeting and a conversation. Let them be the drivers of how much organization this really takes. Sometimes they will step up and say, we want to meet every month, we got to get going, there's a lot to do. I want to set up an organizational structure. Oftentimes, they want to start with an early win, maybe one or two, and see where it goes. So create just enough structure to match where they're going and what their vision might be. And finally, some final tips. I said sounds too easy. Maybe I shouldn't have put that because you guys do realize that this does take time and effort. Like I said before, it's not rocket science, but they take coordination and stick-to-itness. The very best advice I have heard around industry partnerships, and this is not my advice, I'm stealing it from conveners of industry partnerships, and that is just get started. Does it work everywhere? Yes, we've talked about this before. The recipe is more important than the ingredients. So do not think that in your region you don't have the depth and the breadth of resources and assets to succeed. You do. This works everywhere. What does this have to do with EARN? There are two goals that you should keep in mind for EARN. One, the immediate industry-driven training that the legislation calls for and that you have an opportunity to provide in the shorter term. But two, the longer-term establishment of strategic industry partnerships, again, that are going to act as the vehicle for ongoing understanding of what workforce needs in industry has and what other needs they might have that are actually going to grow that industry in your community. You're going to have to figure out how to balance and stage both. So while you're identifying and implementing EARN training programs, think about how you're already beginning to establish strong, long-term strategic industry partnerships. And with that, we'll end on some questions. Elizabeth?
Yes, we do have a couple good questions I'd like to pose, and there are three of them, so keep that in mind as you answer. One was, could you provide some specific examples of early wins for a young strategic industry partnership?
Sure, absolutely. So let's see. One of my favorite early wins comes out of an energy partnership here in Washington State, where they immediately understood that they had some workforce issues. But when they had conversations across employers, they realized this isn't a training issue, it's a recruitment issue. They started comparing job descriptions across common occupations, and they realized that the job descriptions were all over the board. And so recruiting was really, really difficult because Grand Coulee Dam for technician level 3 was describing the job in a very different way than Bonneville Dam was describing the exact same position. And so even putting those job descriptions out into the community was creating a bottleneck unnecessarily in their recruitment strategies. What did they do? They got down to the bottom of what are the actual skills and competencies this job requires, and they aligned their job descriptions. Boom, bottleneck removed.
Lindsay, another question is, what exactly are we talking about when we say employer? Is it the president of the company, HR, or mid-level management?
Great question. I highly recommend that you start higher. And here's why. If you start with HR managers, you're going to get one response, and that is going to be, what are our training issues, challenges, and needs? A strong strategic industry partnership focuses on more than workforce issues. So for your launch meeting, I highly recommend that you go for the executive levels. This is going to look different in every industry. For small and medium-sized businesses compared to large businesses, et cetera, you're going to have to play that by ear. But for that launch meeting and that initial collective conversation, I do recommend that you go to the execs.
One more I just got. With multiple industry partnerships, does one main convener still coordinate everything for the region?
You can choose to do that. I don't recommend it necessarily because it's a lot of work. So the Spokane example to me is the ideal situation, where collectively the Workforce Development Council, the 2 community colleges, and the Chamber of Commerce decided who is the best one of us, who has the most credibility with employers, for example, to convene these individual partnerships. They all sit around as equal partners, but the lead convener for each industry partnership is different. It's sharing the workload. I have seen situations where there is a somebody or an organization that is keeping track of all of the partnerships at some level. That can be helpful. But I do recommend that you share the workload. All of your regions, even rural areas, are going to have multiple industry partnerships because you have multiple industries that drive your regional economies. So you do want to think about how are we sharing the workload across our programs and across even employer conveners so that we don't get overwhelmed.
I'm going to advance to the next slide just so folks can see the next steps, but in the few minutes remaining, I do want you to answer this question. If an industry has been down this road before, how do you convince them that this time it will be different?
That is a really good question, and this comes up a lot because industry definitely says, look, we've tried that. In fact, I'm going to say it's not just industry, it's program partners often are the ones who say, we've already done this, it didn't work. I guarantee you, you didn't do this specifically. The difference, and if you really look at the what works and what does not work so well points, you really start to understand how this is different. And so part of making the case to industry is, first of all, go with the coalition of the willing. You're going to find 1 or 2 industry members, industry leaders that do understand that we need a regional partnership that focuses on multiple priorities for growth. You're going to find those champions. Use them to help make the case to other employers to get on board and build from there. That is a tactic I see work again and again and again. It's really you as the convener finding your chairperson, your co-chair, your private sector chair who really gets this and is willing to go out and say, I get this and I'm helping to make the invite, please join us. So that's one way to really think about this. Again, with program partners, you're going to come across the same problem. We've already done this, or we're already doing this, so I don't see a difference. Take some time to kind of go through what is it that we're doing. Is it that we have 3 different construction-focused projects in our region, but we're not necessarily coordinating across those projects or really coming together to find other ways to support our construction industry? That's different. So have the conversation and be willing to sit down and have the back and forth conversation. Again, that's where time, comes into play. But you got to start making the case that point by point, this is different from what we're doing and what we have done.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. We're out of time for questions. I thank everyone for participating in this webinar. As with the other 2, they are all available for viewing at our website. We are also going to continue to email you as very important information is posted there. Our next steps through October are listed here. Again, because we have your emails, we are able to connect with you and let you know when the solicitation goes out and when some of these other resource tools are available. But I encourage you to continue to check our website throughout the fall. So thanks very much, everyone. We look forward to continuing to work with you.